Hello everyone and welcome to Handmade Hero, the show where we code a complete game live on stream. This is the second day of sorting because yesterday we went ahead and implemented sorting in the renderer because it's something that we've needed to do ever since the beginning really, but it just was never the right time, and it finally was the right time for whatever reason. Just got the whim, the urge to put sorting in. And so we did that yesterday, but we did it with an extremely simple sort, one that has a few problems with its runtime potentially, although it's hard to say definitively, so we'll kind of talk about that a little bit more later on. But we did a very simple sort yesterday, and we talked about the fact that what we really need to do in order to use any sort, even our simple one, is we need to have a thing called a sort key, and the sort key is the thing that allows us to know what elements go in front of what other elements when we are rendering. And we did that, but we didn't really think too hard about it. We just basically put in a stand-in one so that we could work on the sort. And we got the sort working just fine, but now it's time for us to take a closer look at that sort key and actually make something that's going to work a little bit better for what we actually want to do, or that's going to give us the features that we need, however you want to look at it. So let's talk for a second about what's going on with this sort key, if this makes sense. So essentially what we've got is we have a problem of needing to sort our objects in two different ways, really, here on day 230. So let's talk about the sort key for rendering. So the sort key for rendering needs to do two things for us. First of all, it needs to be able to do our fake, our fake sort of staggering of things as they get closer to the camera. So as we have these sorts of things where we've got trees here, and we've got our little dude who's walking around, obviously we want this to draw so that this draws first, this draws second, this draws third, right? So, it's 1, 2, 3 in our current scheme because we want to draw back to front at the moment. If we wanted to draw front to back, which, we might switch the renderer to do something like that later, who knows, we would need the opposite order. But either way, we want this order, and then it's just a question of whether we traverse it this way or that way. But this is the order that it's always going to go in. Okay, so we needed to do that. And that's a simple matter of looking at the screen space y, right? That's the screen space y coordinate, essentially, as it goes up and down. But things are not quite so simple, because what we don't really know is if there was actually some elevation change involved as well in the placement of these entities, because we might want to do things like have multiple stacks of things. So for example, we've got a house or something, and there's the upper level of the house, and then there's the lower level of the house, right? And if perchance you can see through like a hole in the floor or something like that, or a stairwell, if you can see down to the lower region, obviously all of the things that are down here need to sort above the things, need to sort like further back. They need to be drawn earlier than the things that are up here, no matter where the thing is. So even if it's y coordinate, like let's say it was here, and there's another thing that's here. So this thing is, I should say, here. So this thing on the floor, like this thing here, there's a box on the top floor, and then here there's another box on the bottom floor. This thing's screen Y would obviously be closer, right? It's going to be further towards the camera. So we draw this thing last, normally, if we were going to draw these two. We'd draw this one first and this one second, right? But that's not really correct, because we know that this thing is actually always going to be on top, because it's on this higher plane. It's on this thing that's stacked on top, and that's always going to be closer to the camera. And obviously that becomes a problem as this thing is closer to this thing. As it gets down to here, we're going to have it so that they would occlude improperly. So we have to take z into account as well as y. We can't just use one or the other. And you can actually see this happen even on a single plane, and this is the problem that we were having with the ground chunks, which is that if you take a look at the ground chunks, a ground chunk might be some patch, like, a little square on the ground like this. And then there might be somebody who's standing on that, right? So if we have like a thing that's here, like that's on top of that ground patch, obviously we know that we would always draw this ground patch first, because actually all the ground gets drawn before anything else gets drawn. The ground never occludes somebody who's standing on it. It doesn't even matter if they were all the way back here. It still would never really be in front of this guy, right? They don't overlap, so it doesn't matter. But even if we were to consider that case logically, like it extended all the way back here, we'd still render the ground underneath. So we'd render the ground first, then we'd render the guy on top of it, right? So that's a problem, because normally if all we were to use was the Z, and these guys are both have the same Z, and then the Y, the ground patches will come out on top. And so what you can see again there is really what we need is we need a more sophisticated concept of that sort key for our 2.5D stuff. And really I think what we probably want to do is treat Z as something a little bit more magical than we have been treating it so far. I think what we probably need to do is make Z be purely semantic and not be an actual continuous value. And the reason that I say that is because no amount of fussing with the actual sort orders of these things is going to make it do the right thing in all cases, other than simply saying ground chunks always render before anything that's standing on the ground, right? I mean, that's just how it is. So what we need to do is we need to consider that a little more carefully, right? And one thing that we could do, for example, is we could call all of these things, we could call these at some Z, like let's say this is Z equals 0, and then we could call things that are standing on the ground at Z equals 1, and then we could call anything that's flying at Z equals 2 or something like that. Although I guess no, we don't really want to do that. These are still, even if it's flying, as long as it's still in the same plane, it should still be at Z equals 1. And then anything, I guess, that's up, kind of, that's on top of these things is at Z equals 2 on that floor. And then this whole process would like repeat again. So then we'd have Z equals 3 would be if there's a floor above this that's there. Z equals 4 would be something that's standing on it, and so on. So we just have our stacks have this Z to tell us how they stack up, right? And similarly, we'd have here, this would be -1 or -2 or whatever. So we'd have a semantic Z value that's set very specifically and doesn't really have anything to do with any continuous value that we're tracking, whether it's physics or anything else. It doesn't matter at all. And the interesting thing about this is I also feel like this is really what we kind of want to be going towards in general for our system, because we played around with doing things in full 3D. And what I think we found over and over again, because we've run into this many times, is that it just doesn't work that well to treat things as full 3D inside a game that is inherently not full 3D. And so I feel like at some point we need to do an appropriate amount of back off where we say, okay, we're not really using a real Z coordinate. We've got something else, which is like X, Y on the ground, and then Z that's off the ground, but it's still just like how you're hovering or something, right? And then we actually have like what your plane is or something, right? Which is this thing over here. You know what I mean? And this is what we track. This never is involved in any kind of perspective, right? And, so if something is floating up and above something else and going up and down, it never goes in and out of it does any perspective foreshortening. It just hovers there, right? But then this does. So anything that's using that plane value, right, that plane value does create the perspective foreshortening so that if we have a level above, and we want to do something like that, that works. Now, the reason that we were trying to avoid doing something like this was because we wanted to try doing some things where we had continuous motion up and down a stairwell, right? And we actually implemented that, right? You can actually see that happening here if I go into the code here and turn off the ground chunk thing that we were working on there. Let's see, where was that? Where was that? My brain still always wants to look for Handmade world mode stuff in handmade.cpp because that's where it used to be. Yeah. Anyway, ground chunk. So let's see here, right there. So in this, right, if I am to take these out for a minute, and let's see here, run that. There we go. So if we are to look at this, right, you can see that we actually implemented continuous motion between the two levels just fine, right? And now that we have sorting, it even all works correctly as well. Like you can see that the top room sorts on top of the bottom room and all that other kinds of fanciness. So that's all fine. But, you know, the problem with doing that is that when we introduce this concept that we can smoothly transition between the two levels, we introduce just a whole other series of headaches, which is that what happens to the guy when he's standing like just right in between there, you know? We don't necessarily have a real concrete idea of what's supposed to happen. And so I don't know whether we want to actually handle that or not. On the plus side, we can handle literally just you doing it, right? We can special case you doing it because that's not that hard. The problem would be if we allowed everything else to work as well, like monsters being able to like fly up and down the stairwells and stuff like that. I just don't know about that, because if we allow all of that stuff to happen, then we really do need to remain basically entirely in 3D all the time. And it becomes very difficult for the renderer to figure out what to do because it doesn't actually have 3D models for anything. So it's constantly got to make these decisions without actually the information that it needs, right? So I don't really know what we should do about that. I don't. But I'm just kind of pointing out at this point how it feels like we need to do something about that situation. And probably we're getting to the point, since we're running out of like engine speculative things to do, we kind of have to start implementing specific game things to move forwards. We need to figure out some way that we're going to marry those two. And I don't really know exactly what it is. But with something like the sort key, we can kind of see where this is already important, because, you know, we've got this sort of nasty situation where we sort of have all these things that need to work within this framework. So I don't know. I don't really know how we would deal with that. I guess one thing we could do to support this, and maybe this just works, is if you have a ground position that is full 3D, we just snap you to the closest one for your sort key. That may just work. I don't know if it does or if it doesn't, but it might. It seems like it could. To be honest, snapping probably isn't going to work. What we would probably have to do is we'd probably want to do something like a ceiling, a slightly biased ceiling. Because, like, for example, when you start walking up this stairwell, the instant you get a little bit of this up this stairwell, you need to start occluding things that are on the one in front of you. Yeah, I don't know. Like, I just want to make sure everyone understands this. Like, I hope it doesn't sound like I'm dithering over nothing, but this really is just a really nasty problem when you have to deal with pseudo stuff. And I guess there's other ways we might be able to deal with it too. We could do sort of a z-buffery thing with it, I guess. I don't know. I don't know that we want to get into that, but I'll talk about that in a second. All right, so here's the case that I'm thinking of in my head. So let's suppose that we took the case of the stairwell, and so here's the top floor, right? And here's the stairwell going down. Then we got the bottom floor. So as this person is coming this way, obviously this part should always be occluding him, right? The top floor should be occluding him as he moves this way, until he moves into here, at least, right? So anytime in here, he's got to be occluded. But then, as he starts walking up here, when his ground point is like there, when he's standing roughly on that, his head is definitely going to come up above. It's going to like poke up, right? And now it is occluding things that are on that plane. So there's no single rule that says exactly what has to happen. But I think something like, as soon as I'm standing on the stairwell, I'm going to occlude anything on the... I'm technically like on the next level, right? Because as soon as I'm standing here, I think you want to start crossing in that way. I suspect that works. I don't really know. And so the other thing that I was going to say is, another thing that you could do in theory is if you use a Z buffer for rendering. I know there's people who try tricks of like making everything actually look slanted from the side. So, you know, you look head on and here's your guy, and he's he's a little sprite card like this, you know, and there he is, and we render him, right? And this is obviously all transparent, so you don't see it. But when you look from the side, it's actually slanted like this. And the reason that that helps out is because it makes it so that the guy gets higher and further back as he goes, which makes it a little bit easier for it to sort situations like this where part of him should be above stuff, but maybe part of him should be below stuff. It's kind of a weird trick that they use for like 2.5D sorts of games. It's something you can consider, but I don't think something we really want to get into. So I feel like we could do something like that. Not this. Something where we just say like, okay, we could still preserve some continuous motion there, and maybe we're tracking the motion, but as soon as we go to render, we immediately snap that to whatever that sorting plane is, that gets snapped in some kind of a like discretized way, so that the planes of Z are actually known in some very specific fashion. I don't know, that just seems like something that we probably want to be able to do. I don't know. And again, the same is true for the ground chunks. Those would want to be, you know, specifically set to occur in a very specific plane, which is like the underlying ground plane, not the things that are standing up on their end, right? And similarly, like this thing, this solution that I was sort of alluding to here, where you have kind of things that stand up like that, the ground chunks would be lying down flat, right? And so this would occlude the ground chunk properly, even though they're at the same Z, because one is standing upright and one is lying down. That's all. Anyway. Ignoring that for now. We need to start moving towards something where we can get that sorting stuff working properly. And as you can sort of see, when we're doing our rendering, we kind of would need to know, even if we were going to do a system like the tilted card thing, but certainly also if we're going to use sort keys that do some kind of magical stuff there where they've got more information in them, we need to know, for anything we're drawing, which type of thing it is. And we sort of talked about this before. What did I do? I don't know what just happened. I have no idea what just happened. We ran out of size for our push buffer? How is that possible? What did we do? That's very interesting. Let's take a look. Push bitmap, debug text op. What were we displaying? That's kind of interesting, right? Inside our debug end, frame end, text out thing that just displays it, we ran out of room in the push buffer for bitmaps, which is kind of odd. I'm not really sure how we had that many fonts. Let's take a look. I'm interested to see what this says. Let's see. Sort entry at push buffer element count 97. How big are those tiled sort entries, and how big is the max push buffer size? What? What are we, what? How is that possible? We must be initializing this value totally wrong. Look at that. There's no way that could possibly be true. I know what our problem is. We never actually clear that, do we? In allocate render group, if I actually go to the right file, we never actually reset this stuff, which actually brings up a good point, which is we should probably keep track of all the stuff that needs to get reset, essentially. Yeah, so like, because when we render all our stuff and we do an end render, doesn't that, we reset the push buffer, but we're not resetting the tiled entries. So did you guys see what was happening there? Basically, like our sort just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger forever, which is kind of hilarious. That would also explain why our frame time was slower, potentially. Yeah, hold on a second. Let's take a look here. I want to show you guys what I mean. So here's our push buffer element count, right? And, you know, in allocate render group, we were setting it here, and we were also setting sort entry at. These things go together, right? Meaning this stuff all has to get set this way. These all have to be kind of initialized this way every time. But I believe when in nrender, yeah, as you can see in nrender, we actually reset this stuff, but we didn't actually reset the other value. And so I feel like we want to do something where that's like to avoid that kind of situation, because we could accidentally forget that again. I think we want to do like an initialize push buffer value or render values or something, or like clear render values, something like that. I feel like we want to do something like that because otherwise we could make that same mistake like many times, right? So what I'd like to do is gather up all of these and maybe see. I don't know if there's other ones of these that we would want to treat that way. I suspect we might just want to do them all, because I can't really think of a reason why we wouldn't. So like, you know, probably actually all of these are things that would make sense. Yeah, even the missing resource count, I would think we would want to reset. So I think we really want all of this. I think all of that wants to be there. And this stuff obviously is only done once. Like so, and we can also do that, right? And so all of these guys would come in here, and we'd say, you know, clear render values, right, before we go any further, and we'd have our render group here. Render group. And there's the result, and there's render group, and oops. And yeah, so that would be nice. And then down in here, when we actually do our you know, when we finish up, we do clear render values again, just to leave it in a pristine state, like so. I think that's a good idea. It just seems to make it a little bit more, a little less error prone than trying to remember to set it in 2 different places all the time, right? I don't see anything else in here that would want to do that, I don't think. Where is render transform? Does that have... So render transform has a lot of stuff in it. So I think I may also want to do render transform a little bit more completely. So in here we'd say, like, we've got the offset P and the scale. All the rest of that stuff, I guess I don't know if we want to reset it, because the user kind of sets that stuff. So maybe we don't, I don't know. We'll leave it like this for now, but we may decide we want to move some of those in there a little bit later. I'll say to do reset more of the transform. Should it be sticky? So yeah, so I feel like that was just an obvious thing that we would want to do, because now we just don't have that bug. And hey, Kalimian, there's your answer from the pre-stream. The reason we were slower is because we kept having more and more stuff in that buffer. We kept adding things to it, right? So I think that probably had something to do with it. Although, well, no, I guess because the push buffer count. No, so that wasn't true. Never mind. And I guess we are not actually backed faster. For some reason, we were temporarily down at 16. I don't know. It's very flickery. We're going to have to re-enable the profiling to get any more information about that. I think it's too hard to tell from here. Because again, that also could just be the debug system stuff that takes up that extra time. So yeah. So it's faster when we go up here because it's got less stuff to render, right? More stuff's off the screen. But when you're right here and you're rendering the maximum amount of stuff, it's slower. Anyway, ignoring all of that, point being, I think that's better because that is a bug we could have had for any number of things in the render system, and now they're in one place so that we're less likely to make that mistake. which is a good thing. Okay, so back to sorting keys. So yeah, we have the capability to create our sort key here, right? And that's great and all, but we also need now some way, oops, that's not what I wanted. I wanted in the basis, there it is. Nope. Where is the sort key? It's in the get entity render basis that produces it, right? Yeah, that's what I was looking for. So our sort key, we are producing it, but we're not producing it with what we want. The PY, I think, is roughly correct, meaning the PY part is what we want. The problem is the PZ part is not really what we want, and we're going to need some way of handling that a little bit more delicately. And so I don't know, like I said, exactly how we want to do that. I think what we want to do is sort of treat it as something that's, again, like kind of a truncated or rounded kind of value that allows us to do something a little smarter with it. But I'm just not sure. I'm just not sure exactly what. So one example would be, we do know, for example, in Handmade World, we do have the concept of how high it is, like how high it is to the next floor, right? We've got that sort of chunk dim in meters sort of situation. And the chunk dim in meters is like, you know, we sort of said that these were blocks. And, you know, we can introduce the concept, certainly, that like the floors are at a certain place, and we can figure out like how we would go ahead and round those, that sort of thing. But no matter what we do, by the time we get to render entity basis P, we don't have enough information, really, right? We don't actually know by the time we get here whether this was like something that's like a ground chunk that has to be rendered early, or something that's standing on the ground that would be rendered always later. And so since we don't actually know that, it means that either way we're going to have to get more information in here. We have the transform and the original P, but we just don't have any piece of information that says like whether it's standing up or not. So really, like, that render transform is going to have a little more information in it. And I think what we need to do there is say like, okay, that render transform has something in it. You know, we've got the orthographic, for example. We would need something as well, which was like, oh, is this thing, whatever this thing is this thing a upright or not, right? And the other thing about this is that this is sort of starting, you can see it kind of breaks down a little bit here. The render transform has everything in it, but all of this stuff is pertaining to the camera, whereas this stuff is pertaining to the entity. You know what I mean? So at some point very soon, and I think that should probably be right after we finish the sorting, we probably want to do like move this out to its own thing, right? Because it's something that we've kind of been having troubles with, and I think we want to make it so it's something that's a little more explicit in the calling code, where it actually creates one of these and passes it when it's going to, so it says like, here's a transform I'm using or whatever. So yeah, so in this render transform, if we had something that was like, is this upright or not, we would know whether to bias the Z, you know, one way or the other, if that makes sense. We could do something here with that right away just to see if that would work. We could do something, and I guess this gives us a good chance to use our clear render values. Exactly the way I just said we wanted to, which is now here when we're doing this transform thing, we could reset the transform upright to always be true, because most things are cards that are upright. So when we're rendering the floor, we would set that upright to false, and then when we rendered, it would know that that was what was happening. And so when we do that, let's see here, that's in here. So when we do that in here, now we have the option of adding to our sort key the concept that something here is going to be like, in addition to that Z value, we're going to have this ability to sort of toggle which plane you're on, right? So I can keep kind of doing this in a ridiculous way. This is not quite correct, but I could say here, like, for example, well, whatever the transform says, if I'm upright, you know, then I'm going to do something where I add, you know, you could imagine this. So now anything that's like upright is always going to be one, biased one up from this, right? And I guess what I really want is I want it to be inside here, right? I want it to be multiplied by the larger value. So something like that, right? Of course, you have to spell transform correctly. But something like that introduces the bias there. And then that way out in world mode, when I'm doing that quote-unquote bias, like here. So when I'm doing this, now I've got the ability to say that I want this thing to be flat, and it should render behind other things, right? Okay. So now you can see we no longer change what the z value of that ground is, but because we had it bias it backwards to be a flat thing, it now sorts properly with everything else, right? And I can still do this ground sort of sorting stuff here. I can still do it for upper levels as well. Now what this brings up that's kind of interesting, now that we have sorting, we can actually do something that we've wanted to do for a while and get continuous, get the ground chunk thing working where you continuously go between two and where we leave a hole where the stairwell is, which is probably something we should do pretty soon, actually, now that I think about it, because that would be kind of fun. So maybe that's something we do after the sorting as well. Right now, I'm not sure why we do the flashing. I think it's because we only really handle one level of ground chunks right now, and so we'd want to do a thing where we actually did more ground chunks for different planes. But yeah, I forgot we never did that because we didn't have sorting. Now we've got sorting, we can fully make our 3D stacked stuff. So yeah, we should probably just do it. So anyway, yeah, now we can transition smoothly between the two. Everything's sorting properly. Our sort key is not as good as I would like, but like I said, it's something that we kind of have to probably keep pushing on a little bit. Maybe we should go, how much time do I have? Probably not much, because I had to go explain the renderer thing there. Oh, well, no, I've got 20 minutes. So yeah, maybe we should try doing a thing where we like have the stairwell. Let's try getting the stairwell thing working a little bit. So first, let's try to have our ground chunks work continuously. And I don't know exactly how we were doing that, because it's been so long. But I believe the problem there is we only do, yeah, like you can see here where we do our ground buffers, right? When we do our ground buffer updating, you can see here we do like a min chunk z thing. And so I'm assuming that when we do that, the camera bound situation here where we do the min max thing, I don't actually know. Well, I don't know. Shouldn't that do something? What is that going to do for us? This is a good question. It seems like it should be doing a few different layers of these. Well, let's find out. I don't know what the camera bound in meters actually is. So let's find out. So it looks like typical floor height -3 and 1. So that should be giving us multiple levels. So why do our ground chunks disappear? You know? What's the deal with that? Why are we getting that happening? And I'm not sure. But I feel like it should be easy enough for us to figure out, because all we would really have to do, right, is there's a time when we're moving where we don't see any. Like here I am on the ground floor and I see it, right? I start walking and they disappear entirely right there. Now there's a couple things. So we can see our sort key. One thing that our sort key is not handling, and I guess I don't know why it's not handling that. As we get up, I'm not sure why those ground chunks. I suppose this is all related too, because the ground doesn't seem to be moving with the camera properly either, right? Like you can see how it doesn't get smaller. And it should. Like it should be scaling away from us, and it's not. So that also is a problem. And why is that happening? Okay, so that's also happening because of this situation. So that's because we're just not, when we do our ground chunk rendering, we're not actually giving it any z, right? Because here's the transform that controls the z, and it's not getting used at all, right? So we need that, yeah. This is the same old problem, which is why I say we want to do that sort of, we want to probably fix the way this stuff gets handled sooner rather than later. But yeah, this offset really should, you know, this whole thing here where it's doing this delta, this whole situation. And I don't even know, what is this delta z greater than or equal to -1? Delta z less than, why was the rendering, this must have been to restrict it to stuff we could, before we had sorting? Because why would we ever restrict it based on the delta z? I have no idea. So I think this is all, this code is just all from when we didn't have sorting and really probably shouldn't even be there. So that's probably part of the problem for starters. But the other part is we're not actually offsetting this. So this delta should not be in here. There really should be no delta. The delta should be what we actually pass to offset, right? It should be this. Right? That's what we should actually be doing, I believe. And we don't really need multiple semicolons. So let's take a look at that. So yeah, that actually is what we would expect. Unfortunately, our ground chunk, yeah, our ground chunks are now, the topmost one is rendering in front of everybody, which is what it should do. We need that to alpha fade out, and I don't really remember how our alpha fade was working there. How were we doing that? Was that manual in here? Yeah, it was. Yeah, so that's less good too, right? Because we were doing that manually in here, which means if we want our ground chunks to work with that, we'd have to do it. We'd have to do it up there. Now we could, right? We can cut and paste this code, but we really want that to be, yeah, we really want to clean this stuff up now that we're starting to do this a little bit more for real. So we probably want, maybe what we'll do is when we get this kind of to a place where we're relatively happy with it, we'll go ahead and after the sorting, we'll go do the sorting and we'll come back here and actually make this code nice. Because at this point, when we've got sorting working properly, there's no reason not to do this code for real now, because we can actually start rendering stuff, right? Fade top start z is some constants, which should come up here. There we go. Oops. And I guess those will just be set here for now, but we may need to make those more of a renderer thing at some point. Let's see if that helps us at all. So we come up here, and yeah. So now we're actually much more correct. You can kind of see that we're in much better shape, right? Everything seems to be rendering properly now. And so that's actually great. I'm pretty happy with that. Unfortunately, like I said, we now need a way to actually see our stairwells. I remember where they are, sort of, so I can probably get to one. I hope, maybe. Shouldn't it be here somewhere? Oh, right, it's on this side. There it is. Yeah. So that all works great, actually. And so really what we need to do now is we just need to actually leave some viewable space. We need to be able to see down toward where the stairwell is so that we can actually use it, you know? Because otherwise we'd never actually see it. We wouldn't know that it was there. So yeah, that would just involve having the ground chunks know where the stairwells are and not put them in there. Now we have another problem at this point too that hopefully is apparent, and this is one of the reasons that I was sort of saying before that rendering back to front may be a good idea. Now we don't really have to care because honestly, 3D acceleration wise, we're always probably going to be fast enough without doing this. But if we want our software renderer to run fast enough, for example, rendering back to front would be important because what you have to remember is right now we're drawing the entire screen many times. For every level of ground chunk, we're drawing the whole screen again, right? And that's just a ton of work that doesn't need to happen because the only ground chunks we can see are the ones that are like right on this very level. And the only time we can see down to other ones is when there's some kind of hole in the ground for something like a stairwell, right? And so what I'd like to do, what I would do if if we want to accelerate the software render, which like I said, maybe we don't want to do, maybe we've got enough software rendering under our belts that we don't need to spend more time on it. But if we wanted to make it better, what we would do is make it so that we render instead starting with the earliest items and going backwards. And as we do that, we remember what rough chunks of the screen are fully occluded. That's what we would do. Now, unfortunately, there's a lot of work involved in that, so that's why I say I don't know that it's necessarily worth it to do. But it's worth noting, because like you can see our frame rate's not particularly good at 1080p. Now, granted, we can always choose to run our software renderer in less than 1080p, right? So, we were running in 1080p because it happened to be so darn fast that we could, but we can always decide to drop down to something that's more like what a software renderer might have done in the old days, which we'd have more than enough power for, certainly, right? So we can go ahead and, yeah, we can go ahead and run at that. And you can see now we're back up to 16-ish, I guess. Hard to say. Looks like that's an oddly consistent top frame rate, but yeah, I guess we're at 20. So we're still 30, we're not 60 though. But yeah. Yeah. So that's actually totally fine, right? And that's pretty usable, so who knows, we could just do that. But it is obviously always tempting to go, since I know there's plenty of performance left on the table for our software renderer, it's always tempting to kind of go do it because, hey, this is game programming, not game design. And so it's always tempting to go solve a tech problem since that's what we do here. Anyway, but I'm relatively satisfied with all that. And so I think that's actually probably enough to satisfy me, actually. That sort key's okay and works for the purposes that we need it to, at least for now. So yeah, let me take a look at how much time I have left. I've got 10 minutes left, probably a little more than 10 minutes. What I think I'd like to do is I would like to actually go, I'm going to switch this back to, because I don't actually care if the frame rate's slow for the time being. What I'd like to do is I'd like to go to our Handmade render group here, and I think I'd like to actually pull this thing out. I think I'd like to actually do that. We have some time. We know we have to do it because it's leading to a lot of ugly things, the fact that it's this sticky mode in there. Right, the way that all of our stuff works right now, like if we go to where we were just drawing those, we have to like set stuff and then unset it, and it's just kind of ugly. And there's really not much of a reason to do that. There's no point to it, right? Because all we would have to do to make it much cleaner to use is just have a regular transform where we do like, okay, there's a, an object transform or something and a camera transform, right? Where we just have two of them. And then this is here in its own thing. So this guy tracks whether he's upright and where his offset is and what his scale is, right? And this guy tracks, whether he's orthographic and what the meters to pixels is and the focal length and all that stuff. I would also point out that distance above target is pretty dumb. I do not know why we have it, because it should just be something that's in everyone's object transform, probably. Like, it's kind of stupid. But we'll leave it in there for now, but it's not necessary. Like, all it is it's just a value that gets added to offset P, right? So it's, yeah. Anyway, kind of dumb, but whatever. Anyway, I think this might be a more interesting way to go. And then inside here, we've got the camera transform, but we don't have an object transform. And that'll cause a ton of compile errors, but they're not going to be ones that are particularly difficult to fix. So I would say, let's do it. Let's go for it. Why not? So the way this would work is we'd have some way of getting like a default transform or something. Maybe something, you know, like this. Object transform, default transform, something like that, you know? And then we'd just say like, oh, okay, whatever the result is, we make into this. Maybe this would be good too. Or that. Flat. Something like that. Flat and upright. And so we would have something that looked like this. Where you can just get whatever the default is, and then you modify it however you want, and you just throw it away when you're done with it, so that you don't really have to do anything fussy, right? We don't initialize that because it's already initialized. For the flat transforms, we don't have to initialize that. So we'd really just be talking about this is all we would actually be doing. Those would be our default transforms. And now, everywhere where we use this stuff, oops, it's no good, return. Everywhere where we use this stuff, we can, to make that happen. So, okay, these guys are all camera. Transforms, obviously. Like so. So those are not actually object transforms, those are the camera transforms. In here, when we do entity basis P, that's going to need both transforms. And I don't know why we pass an address here. I don't know if we had a reason for that, but I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm just going to pass these by value, object transform. Like so. So it doesn't have to worry about whether they point to the same thing or aliasing or any of that stuff. It just knows it doesn't have to. And so then we'd have the object transform is there. The camera transform is it's getting this information. Yeah. Camera transform. So that's all good. This is the camera transform again. It's looking at the orthographic bit. And this is the camera transform as well with that distance above target. We then have the object transform coming in here at some point. Or is it only with the offset P? The scale there should be in here somewhere, right? We never use the scale at all. Okay. That's probably okay. I'm guessing that that's used elsewhere. Do we really just never use it anywhere? Was that just like, oh, we could use it, so we stuck it in there and we've never used it? Well, all right. We don't use it, we don't use it. We can always get rid of it. Or actually go in and put in the multiply here at some point. Because that probably would be a good thing to have. I mean, scaling. Who doesn't like to scale stuff? Everyone likes to scale stuff. All right, so let's see. Anything else here? Ah, there it is. There is a result scale in there. Oh, nope, that's just computed. No, so none of it. We don't touch it. We just straight up don't touch it. Who knew? Learn something new every day about your own code, which you wrote. All right, so in here, when we do this, now we have two sources. So we always need to have a way of getting whatever the object transform is. So I'm just going to say that that gets passed. So in here, we've got the object transform, like so. and we just pass it on through. Now, every time these people get called, that means that every time we do one of these, that gets passed. Now, I don't know if we still want offset to be passed or not, how we want to do that exactly, because we can now make that be a little bit different than what it was before, but I'm going to leave it the way it is just for the time being, and just add literally the new part to it. So here's object transform, and that will now get passed here. Here is object transform again, and that would get passed here. Let's see. Everyone who calls push bitmap has to think about this a little harder here. So now this is object transform, and that would get passed up in there. And this takes an object transform as well. And that would get passed here. And again, this is really just totally rote. I'm just making this be something that flows down the pipe instead of something that gets set globally on the render group. So let's see, we've got a render transform. For unproject, that's actually a camera transform. And I'm going to go ahead and make that not be a pointer anymore either. Okay. Initializing. Yeah, that's not an address anymore. And what else we got? Transform offset PZ, transform focal length. So offset PZ, so in this case, the offset PZ, we need to know what that was. So we need the object transform to be passed here. Yeah, same here. And what else we got? Unproject old. Transform focal length, that's just the camera transform. Get camera rectangle, that's the camera transform again. All right, and so now these guys, like for draw hit points and stuff, so what we need to do here for the render group that we're doing, these guys need to know when you're doing stuff like drawing hit points and that sort of stuff, these guys need to know what the object transform is now. And they would just be passed through as with everyone else. Where are we here? These are for chunks, right? Let's see, push bitmap. So these guys are not really doing much. These guys don't actually touch the render group transform, right? They don't actually do anything. And so they can just use, and this shows the first way that we would actually use this. This would just be like default flat transform, meaning I don't actually want I don't actually want to transform these guys at all. They're not using anything other than this offset. So I'm just going to go ahead and let them take no transform. Like so, so that they will not actually modify the location at all, since that's what would have been happening. Then in here we've got, so again, this is object transform, default flat transform. So in here now we can do what we actually wanted and not have to do that sort of craziness and say, okay, you know, the object transform is just whatever the default is, and then I'm going to get that offset P, right? And then all this crap goes away. Now we still have the alpha, which I don't really know what we're going to do with the alpha, because that's a separate thing, and like I said, we don't really know what we're doing with that yet. So we won't try to tackle that for now. But we kind of got, I think I've still got like 5 minutes left or something, so I'm going to keep going, since we're right in the middle of this, and we've got quite a few guys to go, so I want to finish this up. So again, okay, so for ground chunk rendering, now we just go, okay, we've got the transform there, we pass the transform in, and that's good. We've got push rect outline, which can use the exact same transform so that it'll line up. And then out here, this would have been using no transform at all. So we could actually just right here do like default flat transform. Could just call it right in place. We don't even really need to do anything else because it'll just construct the 0 value for us if we want to. Here, when we're doing this render group offset P, this is a perfect example. Now this globalness kind of goes away. We can just do object transform, entity transform, and actually do default upright transform. And then we just set its offset P, and now there's no leftover icky state nonsense. And then everyone just passes this one as they're doing their push bitmap calls, right? Super straightforward. Let's see. Here we go. And so this is a really basic code transformation, right? All I'm doing is I'm taking a global variable and I'm making a thing that gets passed as a parameter. That's it. But in doing so, I get rid of that weird like state that sits around, and in that way you can have multiple ones in flight at any given time, and there's no weird confusion. Oops. It goes there. So yeah. I don't know where the particles go. We're not really, I don't even think we kept the particles working, so I'm just going to go ahead and stick that stuff in here for now. That goes there. Push rect outline. Okay, so for this, unproject, render group, mouse P, this will also be, I believe, unprojecting the entity transform, right? Because this is trying to be in that space. And since the transform hasn't been modified here, that would still be the entity transform as well. Push rect outline is, this is for the mouse P, so this is with orthographic, so this is just default flat transform, right? It's not gonna transform that at all. And so then where are we? This is just our cutscene code. And so this would be a default flat transform as well, right? Object transform equals default flat transform. And then here, anytime we would have touched the transform, we would just get rid of the render group part. And we just use our own local one. So again, it's just nice getting rid of like stuff that was sort of being in this weird global state and who knows what was happening to it. It just feels better and safer to me to always pass it through. So there's none of that weirdness. All right, so none of the two overloads convert the argument type. That's true on push bitmap. What is the transform situation here? I don't actually know. It's not used at all. So that, again, would just be a get default flat transform. There's nothing, right? Get bitmap dimensions. So that also does need to take it, I guess. Draw profile in. Yep, this is just a default flat transform as well. No transform. In fact, these guys probably just want to have a no transform up at the top. Object transform, no transform, default flat transform. And put it in there. Okay. Yeah, probably still just want no transform because these guys just aren't using transforms. Good, good. Probably should just make that some kind of constant. There we go. And last but not least, Okay. And so now, hopefully, everything's exactly the same. Like, all we did was just remove something that I was a little worried about. Yeah, it looks like the mouse is still working properly. And all of this stuff is working properly. Doesn't look like our picking is working so hot. Oh, wait, no, that is how it used to work because we don't sort the entities. So that actually is fine. Yeah. All right. Good, good. All right. So I'll go ahead and end it there. I'm glad we did that because that had been bugging me for a while. So let's go ahead and go to the Q and the A, if I can. We'll try. Abner Coimbray, brace yourself. For what? That sounds ominous, Abner. What is your preferred sorting method? I don't have a preferred sorting method. I don't really find that sorting is something I spend a lot of time working on. So typically, like honestly, we could ship this game with bubble sort. Honestly, we probably could. So like, there are plenty of problems in the world where sorting is really important, and it becomes something you really want to know how to do correctly. I almost never face those problems. And so I don't really have a favorite sorting method. I find that I just don't spend that much time on sorting. Tomorrow we'll go over a couple different sorting methods and I'll talk about them, but I'm not gonna like pick one and say you should use this or something. I'm just gonna be like, here's sorting. Every single one of these would work for our purposes. We just won't have a million entities on the screen that need to get sorted. Like, that's not gonna happen. So you're not trying to figure out how to like do the ultimate sorting thing. And I think part of the reason for that is in games, you have such a tight time budget that usually what ends up happening is if you really need a huge number of things sorted, you can't afford to sort them every frame anyway. You've got to keep them roughly sorted and only deal with the deltas. So you end up using something more like a binary tree that keeps things sorted all the time. If you're actually talking about getting to enough elements where you start to care. But who knows? That may be just because the stuff that I've worked on in games doesn't happen to use it, and maybe someone out there has got a better example of where they used it in a game. Hi Casey, I am currently working on an OpenGL framework for games. Wanted to ask whether I can use the code up to day 23 with the intent of making a commercial game eventually with it. Might be important to note that I'm also streaming, so the code might be visible sometimes when I stream. Framework development. Yeah, if you want to use up through day 23, that's totally fine. Gimpy CPU. I know you said you really like discriminated unions, but how do you deal with managing the big case switch they may cause? That is usually handled by the OOP model by delegating to the object. Well, so I guess I would say it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other, right? To me, there's no difference between like, let me take some place where we have a switch statement. So let's take like here. So here is an example like of a switch statement, right? And here I'm going to go down to the bottom of this, and I'm just going to take it, right? So here is this switch statement. And what you're sort of saying is like, well, how do you deal with this switch statement? Now, first of all, my first question is, why is the switch statement a problem, right? Because I don't know. It's not a problem for me. So you must have some reason why it's a problem. I don't necessarily know what that is. So I would kind of need to know what that is first. But the second thing I would say is, why do you think that dispatch solves any problem that a switch statement might have? There really isn't anything that it does, because all it does is it means you have to now take what used to be here. You're going to do something like this, right? You're gonna replace all this code with something that looks like that, and then you're going to have to write this. Now, if you'll note, what you end up with is exactly the same thing. It's the same, right? There's no difference between these two pieces of code. You had to write exactly the same code in both cases. So for some reason, people can't handle the concept that a switch statement just has the code one after the other instead of spewing it out to a bunch of unrelated files, which to me seems strictly worse. But I just want to underscore, a switch statement and a dispatch are exactly the same. There is absolutely no difference to them, other than the fact that the switch statement has the advantage of putting everything the programmer needs to know about that operation in one place, so they know if they change something about it, how it ends up going together, right? Whereas this one might have a potential advantage of putting everything for a particular type of thing in one place. So if you change something about that type, you can change it, right? So one is operation-centric and one is type-centric. And I find that typically I prefer operation-centric because it's the operation that tends to get changed as a whole much more than the type tends to, in ways that need to get seen together, right? For me. But, your mileage may vary. In the case of this sort of code, I also really don't like separating it out like this, because now there's no shared variables between this code, right? If I want to share anything, I gotta pass it. So I can't do stuff like just have a bunch of things up here, like null pixels to meters or something that just gets defined and everyone can use it, or that gets computed, or a piece of code that happens the same between everybody that always happens before and after. I have to start making base classes to do that and all this other nonsense when it would have just been right in line. So I tend to really hate this. I don't like the fact that programmers do this. And I actually prefer this way. So my sort of long answer to how do you handle switches is I like switch statements. I think they're great. I think they're the correct way to program. I actually don't think this is a very good way to program. I think it's got a lot of drawbacks. Chronal Dragon, obviously we lost some performance over the last couple streams. Are you planning to try to optimize it back down, or just leave the software render as is and move into GPU rendering? I don't know. I think probably what I would like to do is use it as an impetus after we're done with a few more things to go back and finish the debug view stuff, because so that we could actually investigate where the performance went, right? Obviously, we know a little bit of it went to the fact that now we draw way too much stuff. And that's the majority of it, actually. But we also don't know if we did other things and so on and so forth. So, I would like to do that, and then I would like to, at that point, make a decision. Do we want to do optimization on the software render, or do we want to move on? Elvin, a lot of times when you develop something you write is the simplest way. A lot of times when you develop something, you write it in the simplest way that just works, then you polish it to something good and more finished, e.g. what you did with D-Sound. I don't think we ever finished anything with D-Sound, but okay. For someone catching up, do you think it's good enough to just study and focus on the better version, or is there value in writing the initial version ourselves? Yeah, you want to go through the whole process. That's the reason why I'm doing Handmade Hero, is because it's the polishing that you need to learn. Like, you need to learn how to do that, because if all you do is study my finished version, the only thing you're ever going to be able to write is that finished version. But you don't want to do that. Like, you want to be able to adapt and make new things and make better things than what I wrote, and make things that are better for your specific case than what I wrote. And you're only going to be able to do that if you know the steps, and then you apply the steps, but you apply them to a different problem, or a different way, or towards a different end, or with more cleverness than I did, right? And you get a better result, or a more appropriate result, or anything else, right? So yeah. Snowy Crystals. Hey Casey, I just found your series and was amazed that you are creating an entire game without using an external library like SDL. From what your episode 1 said, at least. I really wanted to watch your progress through the series, but I have no idea where to start in the 200 plus episodes since I'm already working on SDL OpenGL game. What is your suggestion? I would say probably you'd have to go by the playlists that are on my YouTube channel and try to work from that, because we don't tend to really segregate stuff. We tend to work on stuff as I normally would, which is bouncing around to whatever needs doing at a particular time. So it doesn't tend to be super segregated. Like, you know, sometimes we're working on the software renderer and we might go do something that's in the debug system or whatever. Like, we don't necessarily always go in chunks. So you may have to lean on the playlists a little if you're trying to avoid stuff like software rendering because you don't want to know. Quartertron, I can't remember if you discussed this when it first cropped up, but when you are halfway up the stairs and blending the trees, you get a darker area where they overlap. What's the fix for that? So unfortunately, there really is no fix for that other than using two-stage blending, which is not great. But it's really simple. It's just expensive. So anyway, what happens is we talked about this, I thought, at the time, but I guess I maybe never said what the solution is. So if you've got two trees, normally what happens is you draw this tree and then you draw this tree on top of it. But if we then take an alpha value and we alpha those together so that you know, these are translucent, now what you'll get is you'll get a darker thing here. So when we want to fade out an entire level, we don't really want to fade out each thing individually. What we want to do is fade out the whole thing as one giant sheet. So what you need to do first is you need to first composite everything that you're going to fade out, right? And then you do the whole thing as one giant op with a particular alpha value of whatever it is, so that it all gets faded out as one sheet. That's unfortunately the only way to do it. Let's see. Is standard QSort worth using compared to rolling your own? I guess I would say as Quicksort is pretty simple to implement. So like, I don't even know if the question's worth asking. It's so easy to write a QSort that it doesn't matter. Like, you could call the C runtime library one if you're using the C runtime library already, or you can just write your own. And I mean, Quicksort is not complicated. We'll do one. We'll do one tomorrow. Well, we'll probably do merge sort tomorrow, but we'll do Quicksort as well, or at least I'll say how to do it, and you can see that it's not very hard. And like anything else, you could write it once and just save it in a file and then have it forever. So it's not like you have to write it like every time, right? NORAD91. How would you deal with collisions between multiple entities in terms of collision resolution, not detection, like deciding how to resolve conflicts between multiple moving things? I kind of hit a wall there, not seeing solutions that aren't very ugly, especially movement order dependency. To be honest, I don't think there is much of a great solution to that problem. you tend to have to introduce some kind of logic for it that involves like precedence or something like that. Because computers just aren't good at doing continuous resolution of things. They always want to do discrete things. And so it's really very difficult. I mean, even the universe doesn't solve this problem, might be one way to say it. Even the universe boils down to a bunch of molecules that have discrete kind of collisions with each other at some level. I mean, I guess we don't know. We don't really know. We have no idea what makes up gravity and those sorts of things, I suppose, so it's far be it for me to say. But I guess what I'm saying is, even the universe doesn't try to actually resolve multiple rigid body collisions at once. It thinks about it in terms of atoms and like sums all those up to get the rigid body collision, right? And so you're inherently working with an abstraction over the real physical occurrence. And the only way that you can really handle that abstraction is by having some kind of rule about how things resolve. And so typically, the one way to do it that's fairly reasonable and not too physically inaccurate is to actually use mass. So when you move things, you're moving things and you try to resolve their collisions based on mass and actual collision response. So that heavier things take precedence over lighter things, in terms of how much they move out of the way and that sort of stuff, right? Robbie, you said scaling value is not used, but the camera transfers everything. What is the difference? The difference is we use the camera to do a perspective transform to scale things. And that scale gets used. But we also had a scale value we passed in. But as far as I can tell, we never use that scaling value. So we don't ever scale anything. Everything's always the same size, I guess, as far as it's passing through the transform. But I don't actually know. Maybe that's not true. I didn't actually go investigate that. I can delete all this here. I don't really know. I think the scale, we do allow scaling. So the scale, I think what happens is the scale takes effect earlier, is probably what happens, right? Yeah, here it is. So this is where it happens. So really what we do is we just pretend the bitmap was larger. So it does get used, it just gets used before that part of the pipeline. Karn 1948, what keyboard are you using these days? Amusing question. You said, I know you're a connoisseur, I'd love to hear a recommendation. My recommendation is the Razer Stealth Pro Tournament Edition. Absolutely loved it. It is not what I'm typing on right now. Why is it not what I'm typing on right now? Because like an idiot, I spilled water on it and destroyed the thing. And they're relatively expensive. They're like 70 bucks or something. So I haven't bought a new one yet, but if I had infinite money, I just would have bought a new one. Because they were my favorite. And that's my current recommendation for the keyboard I like the most. Culverfly, how would a front-to-back renderer actually work? Would it test every pixel before writing to it? No, there's two different ways it would work. One is that they just work in blocks of the screen, and they do it semantically. So you use rectangles. Basically, you take your bitmaps and you assign rectangles to your bitmaps. That's the rectangle that is the fully opaque part, right? And you can assign multiple if you want. And then you just union those rectangles together and make sort of a mask, if you will, in rectangle space, so that you can just clip things directly to that mask and never even start rendering them if they are behind stuff. That's the way that you do it semantically. Or you can do it inside the rasterizer by having a flag that says whether all the pixels in some chunk are filled, and it's like a mask. So it's like, imagine an 8x8 square, and you have one 64-bit value that says which things are filled, and you look at the mask, and if that mask says everything's filled, you just skip that chunk entirely. It's early out. That's more how a graphics card actually does it, because the graphics card has to do early Z stuff, and it doesn't have the luxury of doing weird like semantic things like we could do. Mr. Force Dimension, does multiple dispatch come up for you much, as in n types with n squared branches? How do you handle it when it does? No, it doesn't come up very much, and the reason for that is usually n squared in programming in terms of code is usually just as bad as n squared in programming in terms of actual like algorithms. If you have something that's an n squared dispatch, it won't scale because if you have n squared different things, that means if there's 30 different types in your system, you have 900 pieces of code you have to test, write and test, and make sure work, right? And that's just really difficult. So typically, if I have something that looks like it's going n squared, I try to break it into some kind of more fundamental set of types, either where the types are much smaller so that the branch count is low enough, meaning, okay, there were 30, but I broke it down to 4 fundamental categories with parameters, so now it's only 16 total things, so the n squared is not so bad because the n's lower. Or I try to make it so that it's not squared anymore by, again, refactoring what I'm doing into a way that allows it to not work that way. I don't find that comes up that often, but that's not to say that it doesn't come up. So you do have to think about it. And like I said, there's different strategies for approaching it, and which one would work the best usually depends on the situation. Nora91, would you rather have an explicit fall-through statement with an implicit break instead of standard switch statements? Yes, I would. Seems much cleaner to me, or am I missing something? I don't think you're missing anything. I think that would be much better. In fact, probably the way I would do it is the break would always be implied. It's always there. And then, yeah, you would do something like fall through like that, and it's a different thing, right? Something like that. Especially since I usually don't use it. I hardly ever use that. Really, I could get by almost probably entirely with just this. Something like that. Where I just say, here's this is a bunch of cases together. That's really all I would need. I don't, usually when I use fall through, I'm using it like this, right? Which doesn't really even need the fall through part of it much. I'm just saying, hey, these two types both are the same result. That's what I was afraid of, but thought maybe you had some trick, like a messed up pre-computed alpha. I don't think there is a trick. I remember, I think, even asking Sean Barrett, since he's like Mr. Alpha, or Mr. Old School Alpha guy, if there was anything, and he didn't seem to think so. And if he doesn't think so, then there probably isn't. Alrighty, I think we're out of time here, so let me see if there's any other last questions. I know we just got over the holiday break, but will there be a break in Handmade Hero when the Witness launches? Probably not, no. Robbie, are you productive? Feel good at programming no matter how many hours you work per week? I don't think the number of hours I work per week really have anything to do with it. It's how many unknown problems I have to encounter, really. That's mostly it. Like, if I just have a bunch of stuff to do that I know how to do, I can just work all week, and it's really not a problem. Usually what slows me down is when I have to hit something where I'm just really not sure what the right answer is, and I need to play around with it. And sometimes I'm not sure what to do to play around. Sometimes that can be difficult. And that is usually easier when you're fresh. To like push through those is usually easier when you're fresh. And so that maybe would have more to do with like, oh, too many hours of that could be bad. Whereas like if it's just stuff I just got to do this code, it's not always it's not always really a problem for hours. All right, I think that's it. I'm going to go ahead and close up shop here. Save the old Blackboard. Thanks everyone for joining me for another episode of Handmade Hero. It's been a pleasure coding with you as always. If you want to follow along with the series at home, you can always pre-order the game at handmadehero.org, and it comes with the source code so you can follow along. And that's the little button for that right there. Also, we have a forum site you can go to if you want to ask questions about the series. We have a Patreon page you can sign up for if you want to support these videos, which are and will always remain free of charge to everyone. And we have a tweet bot which tweets the schedule at you if you want to catch the stream live. Speaking of catching the stream live, you can catch it live tomorrow at 5 p.m. I will be right back here where we will talk about, honestly, I think you know what we're going to do tomorrow? Because we're going to talk about sorting. I think I'm going to actually talk about order notation for reals. Like, I'm actually going to explain how I think about it and why you should care and why it's not just something for your CS class. So we'll probably talk about that in the context of sorting because it makes sense to talk about it there. It's a classic problem for order notation and seems like the right thing to do. So order notation and sorting tomorrow, and probably the next day as well. And then we'll move on to some other, I don't know what, but something. All right. Thanks everyone for joining me. Until tomorrow, I hope you have fun programming, and I'll see you guys on the internet. Take it easy, everyone.